Welcome. We are now entering our third study in the book of Esther. We're going to be looking at chapter 3 in the book of Esther. And we're finally going to meet the last main character. In chapter 1, we met King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes. In the second chapter, we met Esther and her cousin Mordecai. Esther became Queen Esther. And in chapter 3, we meet the bad guy. And before we actually look in the book of Esther, I'm going to need to give you a little background, some family history here. So I want to, if you want to do that, I really recommend that you write down these scripture portions and look them up for yourself and read the whole stories. I'm just going to kind of like synopsize them. Genesis chapter 36, verse 12. Genesis 36:12. Exodus, I've got them open here. Exodus chapter 17. Exodus 17 and 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15 and Esther chapter 3. Okay? So let's go back to Genesis, because that's where this story actually begins. We're going to go back to Abraham. You know that God told Abraham that he was going to have a son and that God was going to make a great nation, a nation of so many that they would be like the stars in the sky or the sand on the beach in number. It was just a huge number. And at the time, Abraham's wife was 90 years old, Sarah. And between Sarah and Abraham, they decided that the only way that this could come true, basically they circumvented God, and the only way this could come true is if Abraham had a child with Sarah's handmaiden. And then that would be his son represented by her. Okay, so he does. And his name is Ishmael. But that's not the son that God was talking about. He really was talking about 90-year-old Sarah, who gave birth at the age of 99 to a son that they named Isaac. And so Isaac is the promised son. Ishmael is sent away and later becomes the father of several Arab nations. Yes, the Jews and the Arabs have been having problems ever since. Sibling rivalry. And after Sarah passed away, Abraham did remarry and have some more kids, but Isaac is the promised son that God was talking about. Isaac had two sons. They were twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the oldest by a few minutes, but Esau and Jacob were twin brothers. Fraternal, because there was nothing alike in the two of them. They had, and you can read the story for yourself, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but they had a falling out, and Jacob went away for decades and married and ended up having 12 sons. Jacob was the person that God had chosen to be the follow-up of that lineage that he had promised Abraham. So it was Abraham, Isaac, and his son Jacob, who was renamed by God to have the name Israel, which is where we get Israel, Israelites, the Israelis. Okay? So they are all descendants. All Jews in the world today are descendants of Jacob, the younger of the twins. Esau, the older of the twins, had quite a few sons himself, and I'm not going to count them all. You can look at in the Bible, in Genesis, chapter 36, and see a bunch of names and the names of his grandsons. And the name of one of his grandsons, chapter 36, verse 12, one of his grandsons' names was Amalek. Amalek. Now, when you jump to the book of Exodus, chapter 17, we have an incident happen. Israelis have recently exited Egypt. They were in captivity in Egypt, and they have now exited Egypt. Moses is their guide. In chapter 16, they're complaining about not having food, so God begins to give them manna. Okay, this is really at the beginning of their time free from Egypt. They're just starting to get manna and some quail. At the beginning of chapter 17 is the first time they start complaining about not having water. And at this time, God tells Moses to strike a rock and water flows out. And it's a very visible miracle, and sets Moses as the leader that God has chosen for them. Later, when God tells him to tell a rock to give water, and Moses strikes it, it's a different story, different time. The beginning of their 40 years in the wilderness, they needed to trust Moses as God's chosen leader. At the end of their 40 years, Moses is about to die, and they need to put their trust in God, not Moses. So these are two different events. So chapter 17, he has just hit the rock. They've got water. Things are kind of like settling in. And a neighboring kingdom, the Amalekite kingdom, descendants of Amalek. So they are distantly related. Remember, Amalek is the grandson of Esau, and the 12 tribes of Israel are the descendants of the sons of Jacob, renamed Israel. Okay, so the Amalekite king in Exodus chapter 17 decides to attack the just released Israelites. And there's no provocation at all. I personally think he probably heard about all the stuff, the booty, the riches that had been given to them by the Egyptians, their neighbors sending them, go, here, have some gold, here, have some silver, here, have some jewels, here, have some a cow and a sheep. And so the Israelites had left Egypt well stocked, well provided, because God had told them that it was going to happen, and it happened. And I think that's probably what the Amalekite king had in mind. But anyway, he attacks. They attack the Israelites. And this is the story that you might remember from Sunday school if you grew up in the church. The story of the Israelites fighting a battle, and whenever Moses held his arms up, they were winning. The Israelites won. If he lowered his hands, the Amalekites began to win. So when Moses was too tired to hold his arms up, he had a person on each side holding up his hands until the Israelites won the battle and routed the Amalekites, and those who survived ran off. So, but God was not happy with the Amalekites about this. I want to read to you just a bit of what it says that God said. Okay, so verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. And later Moses builds an altar and says, the Lord is my banner. And he said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. So this is not a good thing to go against God's chosen people. And the Amalekites did this. Descendants of Amalek, descendants of Esau. Okay, so now we jump. Hundreds of years later, the Israelites have gone through the desert. They have taken over the promised land as much as they did. They didn't do it completely or correctly, but they did. And then you had the years of judges, all of those judges. And if you want, I think there's a 22-part study of the book of Judges that's on the same YouTube page as this. And so they beg God for a king. And so God finally chooses, they basically chose, but God chose Saul. He was of the clan of Benjamin, and he was big. He looked like a king. He looked impressive. And so he was anointed to be the first king of Israel. And it comes to a point in 1 Samuel chapter 15 that God sends Samuel and tells Saul that he is now to go up against the Amalekites and completely and basically annihilate them. In fact, what God says is, God, the Lord Almighty says, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. In other words, get rid of them all for what they did and what they keep on trying. They're this thorn, this constant problem for Israel. And so God says, annihilate them. Get rid of all of them and all that belongs to them. All the animals, you are not to get rich by doing this, is basically what he's saying. The death is bad, it's sad, and you're not going to get rich from their deaths. Okay? It's like, this is what God tells him. Well, Saul goes with the men, and they muster 200,000 soldiers, foot soldiers, and 10,000 from Judah. Okay, so they go, they attack, they rout the Amalekites. But Saul does not kill the king, and understood probably not his family. But they also only kill the sickly animals. They keep the good animals, and the best of the best they sacrifice to God. And God is furious, absolutely furious, because they have not done what he told them to do, and they're sacrificing animals that belong to the Amalekites rather than their own. If they're going to worship God, you need to worship him with your own, not somebody else's belongings. Okay? And the other thing was that they offered him the best of the best, but the rest of the stuff got split up amongst the soldiers. It was their gain. So they gained by the death of the Amalekites. And this was against what God had said. And so he gets extremely angry with Saul and basically sends Samuel to tell him, in verse 11, I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all that night. And then Samuel goes to meet up with Saul, and he tells him that what he has done, he has not done what God says. And Saul was like, yeah, I did. Okay. I mean, we went and we just killed them. And, well, you didn't kill the king. Well, no. It's like, and you didn't kill the animals. Oh, yeah, we killed the animals. It's like, well, then what are those sheep that I'm hearing and those cattle that I'm hearing? Oh, well, we kept some, but we offered the best of the best to God as a sacrifice. And Samuel's like, you did not do what God said. Yeah, it's like, no, you didn't. And because of this, your line will not remain king. In other words, he's telling him, you're going to be the only king out of your family. Your sons will not carry the name. They will not become king. God will choose another king. And he did. We know that because in the next chapter he said anoints David. And then Samuel calls them to bring Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to him, and he actually kills him. He does what Saul was supposed to have done. But there's no mention of the rest of the family. And that's where we jump to Esther. And Esther chapter 3. Let's read verses 1 through 4. Okay, remember that Esther has been chosen queen. Mordecai uncovered a conspiracy to try and kill the king. Okay, all of this has been written down in the annals of the country. Okay, after these events, King Xerxes, I'm going to just use what's in the Bible this week, honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles, making him second in command. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Okay, so here we meet Haman, as some people pronounce it Haman, and actually there's a cookie called Hamantaschen that comes out once a year, especially. But he is an Agagite, as in descendant of King Agag. Agag. The king who Samuel ended up killing because Saul didn't. Now, also remember, in chapter 2, we learned that Esther and Mordecai were of the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe as King Saul, who killed the Amalekites, almost all of them. So Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites, and is probably, he and his sons, the only ones left alive at this point. And this is hundreds of years after the Saul and Samuel events. This is hundreds of years later. So it's like, okay, so Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites, of Agag specifically, King Agag. And Esther and Mordecai are from the same tribe as King Saul. In fact, some say that, or tradition says that they are descendants of one of Saul's siblings. That Saul and their ancestor had the same father. Okay, so here's that. Haman, I don't know how he ended up being the second in command of the entire empire, but he is. And when he comes in and out of the palace gates, all the nobles bow to him. Now, why is Mordecai there? This is where I say it looks like Mordecai has a pretty good position at the gate of the palace. He's got something important, an important position, important enough that he can go in and walk near the garden of the harem. Remember from chapter 2. So here, and Mordecai refuses to kneel. Now, there are other traditions, other people who say that part of the reason why he didn't kneel, because he would have kneeled for the king. Why wasn't he kneeling for Haman? He probably didn't know the history of Haman, or maybe he did. Maybe he did know he was an Amalekite, Agagite. But also some people say that the robes that Haman wore had embroidered symbols of pagan gods on it, and that Mordecai refused to bow to Haman because if he bowed, it would be like bowing to those pagan gods. Whatever reason, Mordecai refused. He was Jewish. He only bowed to God. He only revered God in that manner. And so finally, day after day, these other nobles are like, well, why aren't you bowing down? And finally, at some point, he apparently told them that he was Jewish. And that's why he didn't, because he only bowed to his own God. And these royal officials go to Haman and say, well, he never bows. It's like Haman is so full of himself, he hasn't even noticed this yet until the other nobles come and tell him. And so the royal officials. And so that's where, and he's Jewish. Is that a reason why he doesn't have to bow to you? Now let's read verses 5 through 7. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is the lot, or like dice, similar, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. We stop there for a sec. Okay, so now that he's been told about Mordecai, he notices him. And he decides that it's not good enough just to kill Mordecai. Remember, he's an Amalekite. He is the last of his people. And it's because of the Jews. And so he is enraged, and he wants to kill. He has to figure out a way to destroy all Jews. Not just Mordecai, but all Jews. He sees his opportunity. And so, again, this book up to now is very precise in its timing. In chapter 1, we see that it's the 3rd year of King Xerxes' reign, when he gives this banquet and everything. And then it's approximately 4.5 years later when Esther goes before the king for the first time, and he chooses her to be his queen. So about 4.5 years had passed from there. Well, then now it's the 12th year of his reign. So another 4.5 years approximately have now passed since she was made queen. Okay? So, king, she's the queen, but, she's not the only thing that's on the king's mind anymore. It's like the honeymoon is over. And so, just keep that in mind when we get to more chapters. Okay, so they cast lots to see when, what would be the best date for what Haman has planned. And it turns out to be approximately 11 months down the line. Okay, so in 11 months from now is it's 11th month. Okay, let's read 8 through 11. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Doesn't ask who these people are. Don't care. He's king. This is the 12th year of his kingdom. You know the saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah, he's king. It's like he's made Haman his second. It's probably he's chosen him so that he doesn't have to bother with all the politics. And so he gives his signet ring, which is used to make decrees, and he gives it to Haman and says, "Sure, write it up, do it, do with the people as you please, whatever you want." It's very, it's hard to like this king, but he is acting like so many kings in history. Let's read the rest of this chapter, which is only verses 12 through 15. Then, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, all 127, with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Okay, so now this precise day is going to be the 13th of the 12th month of that same year, and this is exactly 11 months from the day that they write the edict, the decree, the law. And what is it that they're supposed to do? They are to destroy, kill, annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. It's very similar to what God had told Saul to do, and the Jews would not find themselves in this trouble if Saul had listened to what God had said, even though it seemed horrible. But now this one descendant of the Amalekites is out to annihilate, to do what the Nazis were trying to do in the last century. But they were going to do it in one day, and they were going to have all the people, the average people, do it. And what was your recompense? You got to keep what belonged to the Jews that you killed. It was like, whatever it is that they own can be yours if you kill them on the 13th day of the 12th month of this year. And that edict went out, was dispersed immediately in the language and script of each province so that there was no question about what was going to happen. And that's the end of chapter 3. But I like that last verse. It's like the king and Haman sat down to drink. It's like Haman's like, woohoo! The king's like clueless. He doesn't care. It's like he doesn't know. He has not even asked who. He probably hasn't even looked at the edict. He doesn't care. He got his ring back. Okay, yeah, let's have a drink. Let's drink on that. And the city of Susa was bewildered. Imagine, you're like, what have the Jews done that the king is so angry with them? Do you know anything that they've done? Like, this is just weird. And the Jews are like, what have we done that the king is so angry with us, that he wants us all dead? The city of Susa was bewildered, because of course they would be the first ones to hear it. And that's the end of chapter 3, and we're not going to go into chapter 4 until next time. But now, does it start to make sense why Haman is so hell-bent against all the Jews, not just Mordecai? He's angry with Mordecai, but he is looking for vengeance. And that's the end of chapter 3. I invite you to look up those other portions and read the full stories so that you can really craft in your mind the progression of, if we listen to God in the first place, we could avoid something in the future. God knew. God knows. God bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Good night.